Our fair and reasonable opening bid, let's get things started.
It's a magnificent position.
First call, 1.82. Second call at $550,000.
It's at $600,000 bid.
Going. Are we all finished? All done. All signed.
My instructions are to formally pass the property in.
The chilled winds of rising interest rates are starting to make the property landscape look rather bleak. But there are still fewer houses than buyers, which until now has helped push prices beyond the grasp of many would-be home buyers, especially first-timers.
Are you definitely out there, sir?
As the heat comes out of inner urban auctions, construction's also in a steady decline at new housing developments, with the latest official figures showing building approvals plunging by almost 6% in March.
We've had 4 months in a row of falling building approvals. That's wiped out the upswing that emerged in the second half of last year after the Reserve Bank left monetary policy on hold for a while.
ANZ Chief Economist Saul Eslake says the recent interest rate hikes are the major catalyst for the slowdown since the start of the year.
I'm not particularly pessimistic about property prices, although it seems pretty clear from the evidence for the first few months of this year that things have either softened or come to a halt compared with the buoyant conditions that many markets had in 2007.
Property in any class throughout Australia would now be worth less than it was 6 months ago, but only by a small margin. My feeling, my understanding of that, based on what we're seeing, would be that it would be no more than 5%. And that's not dramatic.
Scott Keck, Managing Director of property consultancy, Charter Keck Kramer, says there are two issues affecting the Australian property market. Interest rates first, the US credit crisis second.
There's a lot of anecdotal gossip rather than analysed commentary. There's a lot of mist. I'm concerned that people think it's far worse than it is.
Well, I think it reflects the fact that finance has become both more expensive and more difficult to obtain, and investors are more pessimistic now about the outlook for capital gains, although, as it happens, the outlook for rents from an investor's point of view is actually very promising.
We're in for a tough 12 to 18 months in the housing sector.
The Housing Industry Association has just released its report for March, showing housing starts look set to remain flat for the next 6 months.
The information that we're receiving from our major members is that whilst traffic through the display homes is still good, there is a significant slowing in contract signing, and that of course is reflected in the figures that have just come out about approvals, that approvals are not holding up as strongly as they perhaps did 6 to 9 months ago.
The real estate markets in Australia, particularly Melbourne and Sydney, have been racing along like an express train for several years now. Well, that train's just pulled into the station for a bit of maintenance.
When things turn around, as eventually they will, then developers will come back and start building. But that's why you've got record lows in new buildings, because it's just not profitable for the developers to do it at the moment.
Matthew Hardman, Head of Research at RP Data Rismark International, says that while property values softened in March, the outlook's not all bad.
There's no reason why, though, Melbourne and Adelaide and Brisbane will not continue in the inner and middle suburbs to do 10 or 15% over the next 12 months. You'd expect outer suburbs of Melbourne to be a bit flatter. Sydney, interestingly, in the southwest, has had a little bit of a bounce. Only a few percent, but it indicates there's, after the falls, there's a little bit of confidence returning in buyers.
Would-be buyers may at least be encouraged by analysts and commentators talking about interest rates having peaked. Last month, the Reserve Bank adopted a watching brief, saying rates were appropriate for the time being. An update on that thinking will be published on Tuesday, after the bank's board meets again. But another pause might put, if nothing else, moral pressure on the banks to hold back on lifting their mortgage rates further.
We are probably at the peak of that official interest rate hike cycle, and that interest rates in Australia over the next 12 to 15 months are going to come down.
They will be on hold until probably this time next year or a little later, after which we can look forward to falls in interest rates, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
Changes in interest rates tend to affect changes in property price growth. If growth was 10% and you get a couple of rate hikes, then growth will go to 5% or maybe 4% or something like that. So you've got to look at what the city was doing before to see what the effect of interest rates had been, and you know, be able to predict what will happen in the future.
Put it together, ladies and gentlemen. I see this.
Optimists may decide it's a good time to go shopping before prices start to pick up again, but there's still that problem with the cost of credit and uncertainty created by the property market collapse in the United States.
The lending practices in the US were far worse. Ridiculous mortgages that never should have been written. People were just borrowing way more than they can afford, and all in the same areas. And so you've seen things like in Florida, Las Vegas, California, Arizona, Ohio, falling 20, 30%. That's not going to happen here.
You won't get, in my view, falls in house prices in the way that you are seeing in the United States and more recently in the UK, simply because interest rates have gone up. You only get falls in property prices in places like Australia where you have some combination of high interest rates and rising unemployment.
Yesterday, in the inner North Melbourne suburb of Brunswick, the buyers and brick kickers were out and about.
Final call, are you all finished? All silent.
But most watched from the sidelines, with only one bidder for a family home which eventually sold after some negotiation. Perhaps a fair representation of where the market is, somewhere between hot and cold.